Zaida, tell me when we're live. We're live? Okay. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to our alumni community that is joining via Zoom. We're very excited today to present the Darnall Alumni Fellow Honoree. Much thanks to Matt and Jennifer Darnall for making this possible. This is also co-sponsored today by Development and Alumni Engagement. And Zaida Vanassi in the back is managing the alumni community, and we will have time for Q&A at the end as well. And also sponsored by the consulting group and investment group here at McDermond Center. I'm going to turn over the introduction of our speaker today to Carolyn Contra. Most of you know her as Cece, basketball management fellow, senior, and co-president of the investment group, who's going to introduce our speaker. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, and we will have time at the end if you don't do it during. All right. And welcome, alumni.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I'm happy to introduce Larry Young. I had a pleasure of getting dinner with him last night, and he told many stories. So you're in for a treat if you're meeting with him today at some point. I've heard that he went on a safari for 3 weeks in Africa, and he lived a summer in Portugal, and he's traveled to many, many different countries. So I hope you all have a chance to meet with him. Larry graduated from DePauw University with a bachelor's in economics and mathematics, and earned his MBA in finance and accounting from Wharton. As a senior managing director at AlixPartners, he guides multinational firms through a complex transformation in mergers and acquisitions, crisis management, and restructuring. With experience across 10 countries, he brings both advisory and leadership expertise in telecommunications, real estate, media, and entertainment. A CPA and certified insolvency and restructuring advisor, Larry serves on the boards of DePauw University, Minorities in Restructuring and Alternative Investments, and the Cole Charles Young Foundation. Outside of work, he enjoys photography, scuba diving, cooking, golf, and cycling, and a proud father of 2 daughters. Please give a round of applause to Larry.
So this is going to be a lot of fun. Thanks for having me. This is a really unique experience. I haven't done this in a few years, so I don't want this to be a situation where I stand up here for an hour or 30 minutes or 2 hours talking to you and pontificating about different things. What I'd rather have this be is more of a situation where we can actually explore some ideas together. When Steve and Amanda and I started talking about this, one of the things they looked at my background and said, gee, you've traveled all over the world. You know, tell us what it's like working in a multicultural, multinational environment. Students might enjoy that. And so that's kind of the focus of my conversation today. It may be a little different than what you expect. How many people here have spent an extended period of time overseas? Raise your hand. How many people want to? All right. Who wants, of each of those groups, who's come over here, of the group that has spent time overseas, raise your hand again. Who wants to volunteer to come up and sit with me for a little bit? All right, come on up. You can bring your pizza if you want. You know, no shame in that. How about the group that has never been spent an extended period of time overseas? Raise your hand. Okay, you want to come up? Come on up.
Okay, let's go.
Now, the reason I'm doing this is because typically when I ask questions, unless I have someone sitting up here with me, I just get blank stares and no one actually participates. So we're going to have some people participate today. What is your name?
Cooper Grabo.
Okay, and yours?
Brian Wolf.
Brian Wolf, okay. So, you know, it's interesting when people say to me, hey, listen, I want to do work overseas. I want to travel. I want to spend time working in a multinational, multicultural environment. I always ask why. You know, what is it that makes you want to do that? A little bit more of a background on myself. Take a moment. You know, I've had the privilege of working with, multinational companies, generally what I call distressed type companies, all over the world, literally all over the world. Companies get in, but what does that really mean? Companies get into trouble. Financial, i.e., they have no cash, or operational, i.e., they can't produce, a product at a price or in volume that they need to. They'll call someone like me to help fix it. So what does that really mean, though? What it means is, like, think of years ago when a captain had a ship going down the Mississippi River. There was no captain that could understand or navigate the whole river by itself because it was too complex and it was just too difficult. What they did was they would bring pilots on at different points in time to navigate particularly difficult parts of the river. I'm that pilot. A buddy of mine, though, said, "Oh, you're kind of like Harvey Keitel in Pulp Fiction," but I don't usually use that particular analogy too much. But it comes back to, why do you enjoy spending time overseas? I've spent the last 25 years working overseas. Both of you have spent time overseas. One of you have, one of you have not.
I have, yeah.
Why did you want to do it?
I thought it was an excellent opportunity to get exposure to just an entirely different, environment and culture and like way of operating and how people interact.
And why do you want to do it?
Sort of the same reasons. We think we're so exposed here in the U.S., but you go to other cultures and it's just so vastly different in every facet imaginable, and I want to learn more about that.
The interesting thing is, at least to me, about working overseas is, DePauw has been sending students overseas since before I was a freshman. Now, I know that's like 100 years ago for most of you guys, but, it made a commitment. We made a commitment, I say we because I was on the board at the time, to making sure that students, if they wanted to go spend time overseas, would have an opportunity to do so. And, and the question I have is, why do you think, as a board and as a school, we thought that was so important? Was it some altruistic reason? No. Was it just so you can go over and have fun in Amsterdam? No. What do you think it is?
We both kind of hit on it. It's the exposure and the ability to interact and connect with all different types of people. And, liberal arts is all about being able to adapt and, flex to the given circumstance. And the ability to do that in an entirely new country is just go within its own. And you can practice the ability to connect with people from different backgrounds by doing that.
How about you?
Yeah, I'd say the same sort of things. Like you mentioned, the liberal arts being that really teaching us how to learn, and when you get that exposure in overseas, that's really expanding so many different new ways of how to learn as well.
Can you move to that? I guess I can do it on here. Sorry about that. It's interesting to me, when you're doing work overseas, everyone thinks that it's the skill sets you need at a given point in time in order to be successful, i.e., some of the things up here on the screen. They think, gee, I really need to know my accounting. I really need to know, a deep you need to have a deep understanding of finance. You need to have clarity on what the capital markets work, for example. If you're working in restructuring or you're doing work with a company that's going through some crisis, or you're going through an M&A type transaction for an investment, you got to think in terms of, okay, what are the core skills I need? Clear understanding of the capital markets is helpful. understanding what the capital structures look like. So what does that mean? What does a capital structure look like? I'm talking about how much debt, equity, and what combination that needs to have in order for that company to be successful, whether you're going through a restructuring or whether it's because of a transaction. You need clarity on how to manage different funding mechanisms. You need understanding for what operational controls you need. So there are a lot of skills, and that's just like a sampling of the skill sets you need to actually do the work. But a lot of people have those skills. The question I have is what makes you different to make you successful? What is it that will drive success in those situations? And, when you start thinking about considering working in a multinational, multicultural environment, what things work in the U.S. may or may not work overseas. The things we assume work for us at a given point in time just don't apply. As an example, one time, something as simple as providing incentive bonuses may not work. In France, I give someone an incentive bonus, it becomes structured as part of their pay, their base pay. In Colombia, it's not a problem at all. And people perceive it differently as well. Some people perceive those rewards as something that is automatically entitled to them for the rest of their lives, and they get paid accordingly. Whereas in the U.S. or Colombia or some other country, you recognize that it's a one-time thing based upon the current performance. So you can't make assumptions. I'll give you an example. You also have to understand how your own biases and the biases of the people in the different countries influence how you're perceived or how they perceive problems at a given point in time. So, for example, I had one situation where we had a French factory supplying a German factory with parts. How many people have spent time over in Europe? So, the French and Germans have had a long history together, and they get along splendidly. But they're very different culturally. The Germans continued to argue that the French were not abiding by the tolerances that they were supposed to be meeting. The French, on the other hand, especially the superintendent, the office manager, let's just say he was fairly dismissive to his German counterpart. We brought them all together. I said, look, guys, whatever's going on, we need to have a really clear understanding for what's happening on the ground. So we brought 20 people together on both sides and had a conversation with everyone being objective and open in their communication. Spent 2 days doing this. We identified key issues that needed to be resolved. And then we did something a little bit different. As part of those 2 days worth of sessions, I identified who was really driving the tolerance issue on both sides of the table. And I had them trade places. Two or three went to Germany, 2 or 3 from France went to Germany, 2 or 3 from Germany went to France. They had to do that for 2 months. Pretty soon, the types of problems that they were having went away. Little problems never became big problems. We never had shutdowns like we were having before. Suddenly, people were actually talking. They were having open dialogue. So, we identified those individuals. Productivity went up. The plant stopped shutting down. People were actually talking and enjoying each other's company. So, one of the things that makes you successful to get past some of those biases and understand each other is transparent communication. So think about that a minute. Communication and respect are critical irrespective of what part of the world you're coming from, and you have to be open to that. When you traveled overseas, did you see any of that?
Yeah, so I traveled to Oman in the Middle East, and I was there for 2 weeks. And like I mentioned, a lot of things that they did, it was just completely different. And you have these preconceived notions about how the day is structured, about how you go about life here in the U.S. and here in the States, and social norms are just completely different over in Oman, and you have to kind of just take a step back. Probably like those two industry leaders had to do, take a step back from what they perceived as normal or perceived as expected, and adapt to a new situation. So I definitely had to kind of reevaluate my own biases and my own perceptions about just how things go and how things are executed on a daily basis.
We had that even here in the U.S. I mean, even when you're talking to people on the phone or on Teams or on whatever, open and transparent communication is helpful, because a lot of times, here's the interesting thing. Communication occurs more than what people say. So even though I'm saying something to you, body language may be saying something completely different. Like if you sit here with your arms crossed, fingers, kind of tightly clenched, and with a frown on your face, even though you say everything's okay, it's not, right? So half of the communication comes not just from what people say, but how they are interacting with you, and most importantly, what they don't say.
And those cues are often different in different cultures as well.
Precisely. Yeah. Precisely the case. Which actually brings me to another point. Recently I was speaking to a CEO of a Fortune 5 company. During that conversation, we got to talking about, how many countries he's worked in, what type of roles he's had. The one thing that struck me the most was that he was curious about everything. I mean, he wanted to know what impacted the community, how different manufacturing was done in different places and around the world. He was asking what worked in one country, why didn't it work in another. He wanted to know what impacted the community that he was working in. He loved hearing stories from the people that he was working with and in the community he was sitting around talking to. He enjoyed listening to people's stories, tasting the food, and smelling the sights in the city. Now, what do I mean by that? Every city you go to has a different smell. Istanbul doesn't smell the same as Singapore. It's very different flavor, just different environment, different vibe, and he enjoyed all that. And I was talking to another gentleman about this experience, to having that conversation. He said, when you're really curious, you maintain a perpetual sense of amazement and excitement when you travel. We also find that many new discoveries working with people from around the globe. We identify and understand different things, primarily because what are we doing? We're asking questions about everything. We're trying to understand something. So that curiosity helps you get through certain situations because you're asking the question, and you're not embarrassed to ask the question because it's born out of a genuine curiosity. So, to me, one of the things that I found as a common trait about when you travel and work in a multinational, multicultural environment is be curious. Maintaining that curiosity is critical to success. Now, I'm sure you've had experiences here, even in the U.S., where that's been helpful. Do you have anything you want to say about that?
I mean, even within the U.S., there's so much difference in the way people, like you mentioned, the body language and how those cues can be interpreted so differently all across the states. And that's really true. You can see you don't have to go internationally to see that, and just to expose yourself to different people. Like even coming to DePauw, I'm from Indy, but there's still different things here, right? No matter where you go, you have to really pay attention and stay curious to see those differences and get in touch with those.
Assumptions kill you in those situations. That's why being curious is so important. As you make, as you go through and get exposed to different countries, you have different experiences, which makes you understand your own culture and biases a little bit better. Did you experience that at all?
Yeah, I just had one comment. I think, curiosity is, we were on a, study abroad trip, so curiosity was pretty much the central to kind of our experience. And I think it's key as well to, be curious, but also be cognizant of like ignorance as well, in the balance between curiosity and ignorance, and not only asking those questions, but doing your part as well to learn on your own and ask intelligent questions.
I think that's true. One thing I found, and I've told this story a few times, is that whenever you spend an extended period of time overseas, there's an evolution to your thought process. How long were you traveling abroad?
2 weeks.
2 weeks?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. What happens is, and I spent 2 years in Israel. I spent 2 years in Portugal. I spent multiple years in Latin America. And all these places are radically different, okay? But the first time you do it especially, there's an evolution. The first 2 months that you're there, it's still vacation. You're on vacation, you're enjoying yourself, you're having a great time. The food's exciting, it's awesome. Then you get to the next period. I'm going to say phase 2 because it can last anywhere from a month to 6 months, depending upon your own tendencies, where all you want is a steak or food that you've had or missed at home. You're like, oh my God, I would die for X. When I was in Portugal, I wasn't used to having sugar put on my popcorn when I went to the movies. Like, what's up with the sugar? No butter, just sugar on my popcorn. I was like, when I go home, I'm having somebody send me some butter popcorn, man, just so I could have proper popcorn when I go to the movies. That lasts for some period of time where you're trying to figure out your own place. And then you evolve to a third phase where you start appreciating the culture you're in and start understanding what's happening around you. And now you actually start listening and talking to people in their language, in their environment, and start appreciating what's happening there. That's the final phase. And that evolution takes time. But it is something that is important to keep in the back of your mind when you're going overseas and working, especially when you work internationally. Because if you haven't gone through that, there's some challenges you may end up experiencing that you wouldn't necessarily be sensitive to. Another I was talking to a friend of mine, one of my coworkers, Chris, who actually helped put this presentation together, who said, there are key relationships that you develop when you travel. As you would expect, I've had the pleasure of working with some of the brightest people you ever want to meet. Just some brilliant people, attorneys, investment bankers, leaders in their respective industries. And these people come from all over the world in a variety of walks of life. But once I was running a company, I had multiple factories down in Brazil, and we needed to shut it down. Now, the CEO of the company, the CFO, the board, everybody saw this. It was a money-losing operation. Everybody was like, Larry, shut it down, relax, just get rid of it, move on. I was running operations in 30-plus countries. So I had rest of the world. My counterpart, he was responsible for the U.S. I don't know how I picked that. I don't know how that was fairly distributed, but I had 30 countries. He had one. You know, we go down there. I said, look, we're just going to shut these operations down. There were 5 factories we had in Brazil. I said, we just shut it down. It shouldn't be a problem. We're going to move all the production over to Argentina. And everybody knew this. Now, if you know anything about Latin America, you know every country has a really special place in their hearts for Argentina. I don't know why, but that's just the nature of the beast. Over time, I developed a great relationship with the country manager, council, my bankers down there, all based in Brazil. I spent time in their homes, spent time with their families. We got to know and trust each other. Now, let's get back to closing this factory. Come to find out, the local officials were just having a hard time figuring out, you know, how to get this factory closed. They just could not figure it out. You know, one hurdle after another kept coming up. And, you know, the local, after some long discussions, I came to realize that the facility represented too much of the local and regional economy for the government to really let this thing shut down without us basically prepaying for all those people's jobs and everything else. It would have been cost prohibitive. The liability would have come back on us and had a materially negative influence on the closure and the shutdown costs. Now, what's interesting is that no one told me that I couldn't shut it down. Nobody. They never said I could, but they never said I couldn't. They told me, gee, you know, it's going to be hard. They said, wow, you know, it might be a little difficult. It might be, you know, challenging. It might take some time. They said everything but, yeah, we can knock this out. What ended up happening was I said, look, if I can't shut it down, let me figure out a way to sell it to somebody. So I ran an auction process, identified a few different sources of capital to get this thing financed. Suddenly, my banker, my attorney, the local populace went into overdrive. We closed in a month. Honestly, we identified a buyer and sold it in a month and ended up making money on the sale. So, you know, what does that tell you? You know, there's a reason God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. You got to learn to listen. And it's not just, like I said before, it's not just what's said. It's also what is unsaid. And typically, that's more important. If I had been smart, I would have noticed that, hey, they never said I could do this. You know, it's just like when you go to Japan and you're asking somebody something, and they don't say no, but they also don't say yes. So, you know, you got to look at what happens when people take a different perspective because of your own biases. You may think, well, gee, they didn't say anything, so I guess I can go ahead and do it. No, that is not what that means necessarily. So I've asked you two why you went to work internationally or wanted to work internationally. You know, why did I do it? I could say, you know, gee, I just fell into it, but I've always loved travel. I find the people fascinating. I find the food spectacular, variety of food spectacular. I love the intellectual stimulation associated with navigating the different laws, currency transfers, banks, dealing with all the different regulations, and creating something and having a positive impact in a variety of different cultures and communities. You know, in a couple of cases, you know, I can tell you a situation in the Czech Republic, in Tel Aviv, thousands of jobs were at risk, and we were able to save those jobs. Latin America is the same way. We go into different communities or different companies, and by doing our job well, we're able to have a positive impact on people's lives. And so that brings me a lot of pleasure, irrespective of what country I'm in, and adding to that a great food, great environment, great people is just a fantastic thing. And I enjoy it. So I'll say this, as you consider your careers, consider where you can have fun and grow long term. If that's in a multinational, multicultural environment, then remember, you may need to augment your skills that you have now to be successful. Specifically, the 3 traits we talked about. We talked about listening well, remaining constantly curious, communicate, over-communicate to reduce any misunderstandings. A friend of mine suggested that those things are all muscle memory. They're all things that we can all learn to do and enhance our own capabilities in those things, but it's something you got to practice. So, when you go into a room and someone's saying something to you, you look at them, you should ask yourself, I wonder what they're not telling me. I mean, not in a negative way, but what is their body language saying? What am I missing something? That's how you ask yourself those questions. Is there something, people say, well, how do you do business development in your job? Well, I get to know people. I'm curious about their lifestyles. I try to figure out what makes them happy and what do they do for fun. So I'm curious. Bring that curiosity. And those are things you can do on a regular basis, whether you're traveling or not. Then when you go overseas, it becomes a natural thing to go do. So muscle memory, you can learn these things. These things are skill sets that you can develop. But it takes time and it does take focus. So in some ways, the real question is what motivates you individually? What's going to get you out of bed in the morning? What's going to wake you up and get you excited? Is it getting on a plane and traveling 14 hours to Zurich? I don't know. Meeting a new culture, having dinner with a Swiss banker for about 4 hours? I don't know. But remember, we today all live in a multinational, multicultural world. Our cars or significant parts come from Japan, Latin America, or China or Germany. Our clothes come from multiple countries from overseas. We regularly read articles or listen to news reports from foreign correspondents or get their perspectives. And we're consistently on video calls with people from around the world. So different cultures and different environments impact every element of our lives today. So remember, the muscle memory I talked about, you can practice that every day. And then think about what part of that really makes me happy and how far can I really take this? And, hop on a plane. Mexico's just around the corner. You can always drop down there and see what it's like. And it's not expensive. You can do that. Increasingly, your success, whether you want to work in a multinational environment or not, your success will depend on your ability to effectively navigate a new environment. So, to me, that's what's going to be the most important thing for you to take away. So, I'm going to end there. You guys have any questions or thoughts?
Here we go. All right. Yeah. So one thing I was thinking about while you were presenting was the language barrier. Like, you've been to so many countries and different cultures. How did you get over that barrier of talking?
Well, 3/4 of the people I met speak English better than me, so they were good. They were. And that's not a high bar, by the way. No kidding. But, in certain places, especially like when you go to rural Japan or certain locations in Brazil, either you have to have the language or, you can't function effectively. But that never really stopped me. My daughter, oldest daughter, went to school in France, okay? And I decided to meet her over there. We went to Paris together, and I wanted, every place I go, I always buy art. I had this thing about art. I'm going to buy a piece of legitimate art wherever I go. Original work. And so we're out looking, this is like, out looking for a piece of artwork. We go to this one area that's a little sketchy. And the taxi driver, I try to get a taxi driver, and in France, in New York, everybody, if a taxi driver sees you and he's off duty or still it doesn't have a fare, he has to stop and pick you up. In France, that's not the case. He can stop, maybe stop. If he wants to go grab lunch, he can say, screw you, I'm not gonna pick you up. This guy stops. I'm telling him where I got to go down to the Marriott that we're staying at. He said, that's too far. I want to grab lunch. It starts to drive off. I said, hey, I'm coming at it from the U.S. standpoint, like, hey, man, this is a problem. And we have a little bit of a discussion about that. He's in French, I'm in English, and we're going back and forth. I'm understanding about half of what he's telling me. He's understanding about half of what I'm telling him. So we get done with this dialogue. We agree to go our separate ways. My daughter says, Dad, up until now, I really wasn't that worried about you traveling overseas all the time, but now I'm really kind of worried. But that said, I've generally found every place I've gone, as long as I kept an open mind and was reasonable and thoughtful, I never had a problem. And I've worked literally all over the country, all over the world.
Thank you.
Did you have any problems when you traveled?
No, not too many. We were in a pretty sheltered environment. We were with like a tour guide company the entire time, so it wasn't really, quite as immersive, I would say, as some of the experiences you have. So, no. And they kind of guided us as well with like cultural norms and like what we should do, what we should wear, how to be, respectful and polite. So.
You kind of talked about it earlier, but oftentimes when we travel, we do spend a lot of time like questioning and absorbing a lot of other cultures, and obviously you've learned how to appreciate them in a really respectful and open-minded way. But what are ways that you've kind of been able to find a stronger identity in yourself and your own culture after traveling?
Say the last piece.
Like, what are ways that you're able to find a stronger identity in yourself and like your own culture after traveling?
That's a really good question. So let me ask you a question. Can you see the Earth better from space or from when you're sitting in your room here? Do you understand it? Which gives you a better perspective? Exactly. So the way I've always thought about it is this. When I travel and I would spend time learning about others and understanding how other cultures operate and people's perspectives, and I get a chance to see how people evolve over time. So you're not going to be the same person in 10 years that you are today. You have more experiences, more. So I have different perspectives on where they are in their evolution. So I learned to develop that appreciation over time. And in some cases, I've been able to help that evolution. Sometimes, sometimes I'm not there long enough. But what that does for me, it teaches me about some of my own biases and assumptions, basic assumptions that I may have had going in that may or may not be valid. My wife always says, everybody seems to be pretty successful in raising kids all over the world, but everybody has a very different approach to how they do it. And that's something as critical as raising your child. So you gotta think in terms of, sometimes there are better ways to do this than the way I grew up doing it or the way that I assumed should be done. Assumptions are a killer. And if you go in with a whole series of assumptions about something without testing out why, then it can lead you into bad spots. And trust me, we got to recognize we all do it. You go into a room in a given situation, you're making a series of assumptions all the time. You got to question those when you do it, though. And that goes back to the muscle memory I was talking about, stretching those muscles, understanding what's happening. Because if you do, it'll open your mind to a whole different series of possibilities.
One more question, time. Anybody on this side? You got a question?
I do have a question. Is there an example of a time in which you've been in a business situation where you're working with somebody from another country or location, and they had no intention of working collaboratively with you, and they were very difficult to work with, maybe had a closed mind on where you were coming from? How did you approach that individual, and what methods might you have used to bridge those gaps and build a connection with that individual?
So there are two elements to that question, and I'm going to give you two different examples. How many people has anyone over here ever lived in Israel or the Middle East? Okay. So when I went to Israel, a good friend of mine told me, he said, Larry, Israelis have an edge. I'm like, really? He said, yeah, just don't take it personally. But understand they have an edge. I didn't understand what he meant by that. So he gave me like 3 or 4 books to read, and they were helpful. But I had never been in an environment where everybody, including the janitor, had an opinion of how good a job I was doing and would express it in forceful ways. I mean, I'm telling you, everybody. And if they didn't think it was the right thing to do, believe me, you heard about it a lot, and directly and indirectly. And even in the U.S., I had never experienced something like that before. So that was a situation where you had to convince people that your way was the right way to do it. They weren't necessarily not wanting to help, but they were just firmly set in their belief that this was the wrong thing to do. That's one scenario, and that was a cultural issue that you had to get used to because that's how they interface. Okay, that's one. Other situations where you have a direct misalignment of goals and objectives, and that person is just a bad actor, you have to read that situation. And unfortunately, in most companies you go into, there's always one. There's always one person like that who just, and it's sad to say, but that person sometimes just doesn't make it. I mean, they got to figure out an alternative strategy if they are misaligned with the goals, objective, values that you want to put down and put in place, then that can be toxic to what you actually want to accomplish. But you got to be able to read both sides of that. It's easy to go in and fire a bunch of people. Not very productive, but that's an easy solution just because someone disagrees with you. I prefer to have people disagree with me. If I'm going into a meeting and everybody's nodding their head up and down, I'm in the wrong room and I got the wrong people around me.
Thank you. That is so good. And we've run out of time, as it always happens. Thank you again to Larry for being here and being on Zoom. Thank you to our alumni community as well for joining us. And Larry will be up here for 10 or 15 more minutes before we whisk him to the next thing. I would encourage you to explore your winter term as Brian did, and the opportunity to study abroad and get your feet wet.